Historically speaking, Qatar should not be hosting a World Cup. Firstly, the country is way too small, much smaller than any nation that has hosted this tournament over the last 92 years. Secondly, Qatar really doesn't have a football pedigree, never having participated in the final stages of the tournament before, and only really having one major stadium compliant with World Cup expectations at the time its bid was submitted, a decade or so ago. And finally, Qatar's climate really doesn't lend itself to hosting FIFA World Cups in their traditional months of June and July, when it is simply unbearably hot across all the Arabian Peninsula. So how come Qatar is hosting the tournament? Much has been written about Qatar's incredibly wealthy economy, which has seen unprecedented levels of growth and development over the last several decades, or the country's strong ties to major Western countries, which have been underpinned by both political and military interests, but also significant economic stakes in the country's unique natural resource projects. In this video, we will explore the story behind both Qatar's rapid ascent up the global wealth ladder, as well as the investment the country has had to make in order to earn the right to stage the latest edition of the FIFA World Cup in 2022. Stay tuned. Qatar is a small country located on the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Interestingly, Qatar's only land border is with Saudi Arabia, running 54 miles or 87 kilometers in the south, with the country otherwise surrounded by nothing but the waters of the Persian Gulf. Another somewhat unusual fact about Qatar is that over 80% of the country's total population lives in the capital city, Doha. This kind of concentration of people isn't very common in other parts of the world, but it is a necessity of life in Qatar, not only because of its proximity to water in an otherwise desert location, but also because it makes rapid economic development possible. Qatar has been ruled by the Al Thani family since the late 19th century, when it was first recognized as a separate entity by the British monarchy. Having been under Ottoman rule and the British protectorate throughout the late 19th century and early to mid-20th centuries, Qatar finally gained independence in 1971. The country's current ruler, Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, is a 42-year-old who has been in power since 2013, having taken over from his father, Hamid bin Khalifa Al Thani. Like his father before him, the current emir was educated in the UK, having graduated from the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst in 1998 and started his career in the Qatar Armed Forces. Since coming to power, Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani continued his father's legacy to further develop Qatar's regional and global stature, both economically and politically. Oil and gas have traditionally been the backbone of Qatar's economy, accounting for around 60% of the country's GDP and over 80% of its total exports. Oil was first discovered in the 1940s and has been a dominant sector of the economy since the mid-1970s, when large-scale industrial production ramps up. Qatar's major gas reserves are located offshore, underneath the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. The reserve is located across the territorial waters of both Qatar and Iran, which means that it had to be split into two separate gas fields for production purposes, the so-called North Field in Qatar and the so-called South Fars deposit in Iran. Standing at 1,200 trillion cubic feet, or 35,000 cubic kilometers, this is by far the largest conventional, non-associated gas field in the world, over 5 times the size of the next biggest rival, and representing over 10% of the world's total gas reserves. Qatar's North Field project has been developing in phases, starting from around the 1990s. In the early days, gas from the North Field was only supplied locally, as the country struggled to secure the more lucrative long-term international export agreements. Things eventually picked up, and the national gas producer, Qatar Gas, is currently the largest liquefied natural gas company in the world, supplying over 80 million tons of liquid natural gas per year through its various ventures. Some of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, including US-based ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, UK-based Shell, and France-based Total, are all joint venture partners in Qatar Gas's various entities. This brings Qatar Gas not only the Western money and technology to develop the deposit, but also a certain degree of geopolitical interest in keeping the country safe and stable, given the amount of Western capital that is tied up in Qatari assets. Interestingly, there is no income taxes for Qatari-owned companies in the country, a measure that is made possible by the government's direct ownership of both Qatar Gas and its parent company, Qatar Energy. In comparison, in typical Western economies, major companies are often owned by private investors, and so governments have to use taxes as a mechanism for reclaiming a portion of their earnings for national purposes. In Qatar, there is no need for that, because all of Qatar Gas's and Qatar Energy's profits, except those that are due to their foreign joint venture partners, end up directly in the government's pockets to begin with. Over the last decade or so, Qatar has been trying hard to diversify its economy away from its single-minded dependence on the vast money that comes from exploiting natural resources. As an example, the government of Qatar has built a number of manufacturing enterprises, including petrochemical plants, fertilizer plants, and steel mills. All of these companies are natural adjacencies for when you have cheap gas, and so they make great economic sense to have in an economy like Qatar's. However, all of them combined only account for about a tenth of the country's overall GDP, and therefore have not been enough to meaningfully diversify Qatar's economy away from its reliance on the oil and gas revenues. Another step towards diversifying the economy has been the creation of the Qatar Investment Authority. QIA is the country's sovereign wealth fund and is responsible for investing Qatar's surplus profits into successful companies and other financial instruments both domestically but also, and more importantly, internationally. Astonishingly, the company has an estimated $500 billion locked away across the various investments it has accumulated over the last decade, the most famous of which have included stakes in marquee Western companies such as Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, London Heathrow Airport, Valentino Fashion Group, and France's leading football club, Paris Saint-Germain. All in all, thanks to its natural gas wealth, Qatar has quickly transitioned from being one of the poorest countries in the world, whose main trade used to be diving for pearls in the Persian Gulf, to being one of the world's wealthiest. Thanks to the fact that Qatar only has a tiny local population of around 300,000 people, with foreign workers making up the other 2.5 million. All of the vast wealth that has come from its natural resources is spread over a much smaller denominator than it would in most other resource-rich economies. As a result, Qatar is currently 16th in the world in terms of GDP per capita, ahead of countries like Sweden, Australia, the UK, and Germany. With this newfound wealth, Qatar has developed a new taste for hosting major international cultural and sporting events. Over the last 2 decades, Qatar has hosted events ranging from the 2006 Asian Games to the 2012 UN Climate Change Conference. But of course, the main event and the biggest source of pride for Qatar's national spirit over the last decades is the 2022 FIFA World Cup. When Qatar was awarded hosting rights for the 2022 FIFA World Cup a decade ago, the country knew it would have to invest. As an example, of the 8 stadiums that are hosting the tournament currently, only one, Khalifa International Stadium, was in existence at the time of submitting the bid in late 2000s. The other 7 had to be constructed from scratch over a period of the last 10 years, at an average cost of around $500 million apiece, or around $5 billion altogether. But stadiums were only a small portion of the overall investment budget of over $200 billion, which Qatar has had to invest in order to prepare itself for hosting an event of the World Cup's magnitude. The single biggest project included in the budget was Lusail, a brand new city, which was built 14 miles or 23 kilometers north of Doha, in a place that was once a stronghold for one of the Al Thani family's previous rulers. The city is planned to have enough infrastructure to support a population of around 500,000 people in the future, and will become the country's second largest city after Doha once it's fully settled. The city measures 15 square miles or 38 square kilometers in size, and includes a couple dozen zones, including the north and waterfront residential districts, the golf district, the stadium district, 2 energy cities, a medical and education district, an entertainment island, and several others. The stadium district is the jewel in Qatar's 2022 World Cup crown, as it is home to the Lusail iconic stadium, the 88,000-seater, which will host the final game of the tournament on the 18th of December 2022. Qatar's other big investments include the Doha Metro, the Doha Airport, a new port, upgrades to Doha's downtown quarters, new economic zones, new or upgraded roads, and numerous other infrastructure. Doha's brand new metro is particularly impressive, having been launched in May of 2019 and featuring 3 lines that cover over 70 kilometers of rail across 40 stations. The metro has taken about a decade to construct and launch, features one of the fastest driverless train systems in the world, and is meant to transport millions of fans around the tournament venues during the World Cup. All in all, the size of the investment that Qatar has made into getting ready for the tournament is quite simply unprecedented. But now all that money has been spent, the stadiums and other infrastructure constructed, and the tournament games underway, the question on everyone's minds is, was it worth it? Given the scale of Qatar's economy and the fact that pure sport infrastructure was only a small fraction of the overall investment budget, the answer is likely to be maybe. As an example, the new city Lusail is meant to be a place primarily for white-collar, service-based workers, which should, in theory, help with Qatar's economic diversification efforts. The new metro, airport, and economic zones and other infrastructure should also help expand the range of economic activity that the country can support in the future. So, as Qatar's officials have sometimes been quoted as saying, most of these investments would have been made anyway, and the World Cup was simply a way to link them to a major, visible deadline. Whatever the case may be, Qatar's meteoric rise to the list of the top 20 wealthiest countries in the world has been remarkable. And it looks like the country isn't done yet, with plans for further economic growth well underway. And once that happens, Qatar might be on the lookout for the next iconic international event to host, to suitably mark this next level of economic achievement.